Welcome to the Pro Ticker Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
So right now, as we're speaking, there is an artificial intelligence company making a staggering $44 billion a year.
Yeah, which is just an astronomical number.
It's insane, and they are projecting an operating profit faster than Google, Facebook, or Amazon ever did.
Right, they're breaking all the historical speed limits.
But here is the wild part for you listening. Every single month, they take $1.25 billion of that cash and hand it directly to their biggest rival.
Just to keep the lights on, basically.
Exactly. So today, we are tearing apart this impossible math. We're getting into the creative accounting and, this massive multi-billion-dollar race to control the physical infrastructure of the future.
Because we are looking at the exact moment generative AI shifts from a cash-burning laboratory experiment into a capital-efficient heavy industry.
Heavy industry. I like that. Okay, let's unpack this because the numbers coming out of the sector this quarter are basically the blueprints of a new industrial revolution.
They really are. I mean, we're witnessing a structural inflection point here.
Because for the last 5 years, the whole narrative has been that these frontier AI models are just black holes for capital. Right?
Exactly. The assumption was you pour tens of billions into specialized data centers, and, maybe a decade from now, you actually see a return.
Right, maybe.
But Anthropic's Q2 2026 projections have just completely dismantled that assumption.
Yeah, they blew it out of the water. So let's hit the audience right between the eyes with these Q2 financial projections, because they redefine what hypergrowth even looks like.
They do. So Anthropic is projecting $10.9 billion in revenue for the June quarter alone.
Just the June quarter. $10.9 billion.
Right. And that is a 130% jump from the $4.8 billion they generated in Q1.
Which is already a huge leap. But the real kicker for me is the projected operating profit, $559 million.
Yeah, that's the number that shocked Wall Street.
Because the prevailing assumption across the whole tech sector was that the massive infrastructure costs required to run these models would prevent basically any AI lab from seeing a dime of profit until at least 2028.
Or even 2030, depending on which analyst you ask.
Wow, 2030.
Yeah. The capital expenditure required to train and run these models is so vast that the accepted wisdom was just a mandatory decade-long burn rate.
Just burning cash. But if we track the annualized revenue run rate, the ARR timeline, the acceleration breaks all the conventional financial models.
It really does. I mean, let's look at the timeline. In 2022, they were doing roughly $10 million.
Okay, 10 million.
By the end of 2023, around $100 million. At the end of 2024, they hit $1 billion.
Wait, I just have to pause there. Reaching 1 billion ARR is usually the crowning achievement of a software company's entire life cycle.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, it takes a successful enterprise SaaS company over a decade of just grinding to hit that number.
And yet, they didn't stop to celebrate at all. By the end of 2025, they hit $9 billion.
$9 billion in 1 year.
Yeah. And by April of 2026, they reached $30 billion, which officially surpassed OpenAI's confirmed $24 billion run rate.
Which is huge news on its own.
Right. And now, going into Q2, that ARR sits at an astonishing $44 billion.
Okay, but wait, I need to stop you there, because the math on the profit side feels fundamentally broken to me.
How so?
Well, a 130% revenue jump in a single quarter is one thing, but getting to a $559 million operating profit means their costs are not scaling at the same rate as their usage.
Right, the costs are decoupling from the revenue.
Exactly. The numbers indicate that between the first and second quarters of 2026, their computing costs dropped from 71 cents to 56 cents for every dollar of revenue generated.
Which is a massive efficiency gain.
But a 15-cent drop per dollar in just 3 months sounds impossible for physical hardware. I mean, silicon doesn't just get 20% cheaper in a single quarter.
No, it definitely doesn't.
So they must be cheating the software layer somehow. How are they doing that?
Well, they're achieving massive operational leverage through engineering breakthroughs at the inference layer.
Okay, inference. Define that for us real quick.
Sure. So inference is the computational cost of actually running the model every time a system makes a request.
So not the training part.
Right. When you hear about AI costing billions, there are two phases. Training the model, which is the massive upfront cost, and then inference, which is the daily operating cost.
So how do you squeeze 15 cents of margin out of inference in basically 90 days?
It's a combination of architectural shifts,
Yeah.
but primarily it's prompt caching and vastly improved hardware utilization.
Prompt caching. Okay, walk me through that.
Let's say an enterprise client uploads a massive 500-page legal code base to an AI, and they ask 50 different questions about it throughout the day.
Right, which happens all the time in corporate setting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Previously, the AI essentially had to read and process that entire 500-page document 50 separate times.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was recomputing the exact same context over and over, just burning expensive GPU cycles.
So it's like building a rocket while you're already in orbit and suddenly realizing you're actually turning a profit on the fuel. Or, wait, let me try another analogy. It's like running a high-end restaurant where the chef insists on driving to the farm to pick a new tomato for every single salad ordered.
Yes, rather than just stocking the kitchen in the morning.
Right, that sounds incredibly inefficient.
It was, and that is a perfect way to visualize it. What Anthropic implemented is highly efficient state caching.
Meaning they just keep the tomatoes in the kitchen now.
Precisely. Now, the model processes that massive context window once. It holds the mathematical representation of that document in its short-term memory and simply accesses it for subsequent queries.
So the compute cost of the second, third, and 50th query just drops?
It drops to near zero. Add to that advanced request batching, which is cramming more cognitive work through the exact same silicon simultaneously, and you get gross margins that expand even as request volumes just explode.
That makes sense. But I have to ask about historical context here.
Okay, sure.
If we look back at the biggest tech explosions, like the rollouts of Google, the virality of Facebook, the massive cloud migrations for AWS, or even Zoom during the pandemic lockdowns, has anyone ever added over $6 billion of new top-line revenue in 90 days?
The answer is a definitive no.
Never.
Never. If we review the IPO trajectories of over 200 public software companies over the last 2 decades, there is just no parallel.
Not even close.
Not even close. Take Salesforce, right? A titan of enterprise software. It took them roughly 2 decades to reach a $30 billion annual revenue mark.
2 decades. And Anthropic did it in what, 4 years?
Under 4 years, they went from 10 million to 44 billion. The velocity of value creation here is entirely without historical precedent.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It really is. We're not just looking at a successful product. We're looking at a fundamental restructuring of how businesses allocate capital.
Which begs the obvious question for you listening. Who is actually pinging those servers to generate $44 billion?
That is the right question.
Because if you look at consumer awareness, OpenAI is still the undisputed giant. They have roughly 900 million weekly active users on their consumer app.
Right. Massive consumer footprint.
And Anthropic has maybe 5% of that consumer user base, yet they are the ones printing the heavier revenue run rate.
Exactly.
So how does a company with a fraction of the users make more money?
That contrast reveals the core engine of this specific financial miracle. OpenAI took a consumer-first approach.
They wanted to be the household name.
Right. They went for maximum virality and maximum user adoption, making ChatGPT a brand everyone knows.
And charging $20 a month for it.
Exactly. They monetize through millions of individuals paying $20 a month. Anthropic, conversely, bypassed the viral consumer app race almost entirely.
And they just ignored it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
They focused relentlessly on B2B, business-to-business enterprise contracts.
So they aren't chasing the college student writing a term paper. They are chasing the Fortune 500 company.
80% of Anthropic's revenue comes directly from B2B enterprise contracts.
Wow, 80%.
And the scale of these deals is staggering. Over 1,000 corporate customers are now spending more than $1 million annually on their services.
$1 million a year per company.
Yeah, and that metric, the $1 million accounts, it doubled in just 2 months leading up to Q2.
But doesn't that mean they are missing out on the cultural zeitgeist? The narrative has always been that whoever owns the consumer mindshare owns the future of the platform.
That's the traditional Silicon Valley playbook, yeah.
Right. So is ignoring the consumer side actually their secret weapon?
It is entirely their secret weapon, and it all comes down to the concept of churn.
Churn, like people canceling their subscriptions.
Exactly. Consumer subscriptions are inherently fickle. Users cancel when they get bored, when their budget gets tight, or when they just switch to a slightly cheaper, newer competitor.
Because a $20 subscription has basically zero switching costs. You just click cancel.
Right. B2B revenue, however, is incredibly sticky.
Sticky meaning once you are in, you never leave.
Think about the mechanics of enterprise integration. When a multinational logistics firm integrates an AI model into its core supply chain software, its customer service routing, and its internal data analysis pipelines. They spend millions just on the integration architecture.
Just to get it wired up.
Exactly. They train their staff on the specific API nuances of that model. If a competitor offers a slightly cheaper model a year later, the logistics firm doesn't just swap it out.
Because it would break everything.
Right, the cost of ripping out the foundational plumbing of their software is massive. Anthropic isn't selling a subscription. They are becoming corporate infrastructure.
And there's one specific piece of infrastructure driving this that we really have to spotlight. Claude Code.
Oh yeah, Claude Code.
Because this isn't just a chatbot answering emails for HR.
No, Claude Code is the breakout product of the decade. It launched publicly in May of 2025.
And what did it do in revenue?
Within 6 months, it hit a $1 billion annualized revenue run rate all on its own.
$1 billion in 6 months for a single coding tool.
Yeah. And what makes it so revolutionary is that it is an agentic coding tool.
Agentic, meaning it has agency.
Right. It doesn't just sit in a text box and give you snippets of Python when you ask.
Yeah.
It actively reads an entire corporate repository. It identifies bugs, writes the necessary code to fix them, runs the code in an isolated testing sandbox, and then issues a pull request for a human to review.
So it's literally acting as a junior software engineer.
It is acting as a fleet of thousands of junior software engineers.
That is terrifying and amazing.
Recent metrics show that Claude Code now authors 4% of all public GitHub commits globally.
4% of all code on GitHub.
And projections suggest that number will hit 20% by the end of this year. 1 in 5 pieces of code being merged on the largest developer platform in the world will be written by this single enterprise tool.
So when a company signs $1 million contract for this, they aren't comparing that cost against other software tools.
No, they are comparing that cost against payroll.
Wow, that shifts the whole paradigm.
Capturing the developer layer fundamentally changes enterprise software spending. Companies are outsourcing entire foundational layers of their engineering departments to this model.
Because it's cheaper than hiring 50 engineers.
Exactly. If you can replace the initial drafting and bug-fixing work of a 50-person engineering team with a centralized AI agent, you will gladly pay millions of dollars a year for that API access. The return on investment is immediate and massive.
Okay, so the revenue is undeniably real. The code is being written, the enterprise adoption is deeply entrenched.
Very entrenched, yes.
But let's take a hard look at the actual profit. Because when you strip away the celebratory press releases and look at the fine print behind that $559 million operating profit headline, I see a 5% margin that seems, frankly, entirely manufactured.
Well, you're pointing to the tension between GAAP and non-GAAP accounting, which is really where the true story of AI economics is told.
Right. Break down GAAP for us.
GAAP stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. It's the standardized, legally mandated framework public companies use to report their earnings.
To make sure it's an apples-to-apples comparison.
Exactly. But private companies, like Anthropic, often release non-GAAP metrics.
Which means they get to customize the math to tell the story they want.
Basically, yes.
So in this specific $559 million profit calculation, what massive expense are they quietly sweeping under the rug?
So the non-GAAP figure commendably includes the massive computational costs of training the models and the inference costs we discussed.
Okay, so the hardware is accounted for.
Yes, but it explicitly excludes stock-based compensation, or SBC.
Wait. Here's where it gets really interesting. If you are ignoring the massive salaries paid in company stock to your top AI researchers, aren't you just ignoring the biggest operational bill in the house?
From a human capital perspective, yes.
I mean, you can't just pretend you aren't paying your staff because you are paying them in equity instead of cash.
It is a controversial accounting maneuver, for sure. But to understand why they do it, you really have to understand the talent war in artificial intelligence.
The bidding wars for engineers are legendary right now.
You cannot hire the world's best machine learning engineers with a standard cash salary. The talent pool capable of building frontier models is incredibly small.
So they have all the leverage.
Exactly. For instance, Anthropic recently hired Andrej Karpathy. He was a former head of AI at Tesla and a founding member of OpenAI.
A huge hire.
To secure talent of that magnitude, you don't offer a $500,000 salary. You offer massive equity grants worth tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
Stock-based compensation in this sector is astronomical.
So they are essentially printing stock like monopoly money to attract the best brains on Earth.
That's one way to look at it.
But if we force this incredible quarter into a standard gap framework, meaning they legally had to account for all that stock being handed out to engineers as a real bottom line expense, what happens to that razor-thin 5% profit margin?
It would almost certainly invert into a deep net loss.
A loss. So the profit vanishes.
Yes. The cost of human capital at the frontier of AI is simply too high to sustain profitability if you measure it in traditional terms.
So why the sudden urge to broadcast this highly specific, customized, non-GAAP profit right now? If the true profitability is basically a mirage, who is this performance for?
The timing is everything here. These numbers were strategically leaked to the financial press during an active, ongoing funding round.
Ah, of course, follow the money.
Always. Anthropic is currently attempting to raise capital at an eye-watering $900 billion valuation.
Nearly $1 trillion. For a private company, that's wild.
When you walk into a room of institutional venture capitalists and sovereign wealth funds, and you ask them to value your company at $900 billion, you need a flawless narrative.
You can't just show them a spreadsheet of losses.
Exactly. You have to prove that your underlying business model isn't just a bottomless furnace for server costs.
Right.
So by presenting a non-GAAP operating profit, Anthropic is demonstrating structural operational leverage. They're saying to investors, look, our core product generates more cash than it costs to run.
The hardware pays for itself?
Right.
Yeah.
The only reason we aren't profitable on paper is because we are generously paying our talent in shares, shares that you, the investor, will eventually help take public.
It's an accounting flex designed entirely for fundraising.
It absolutely is.
But if you are diluting your equity that aggressively just to hire humans, your cash reserves must be completely drained by the non-human element, the physical hardware.
Yes, the physical footprint is where the real cash goes.
Because you cannot pay the electricity bill in stock options. Duke Energy doesn't take equity.
No, they certainly do not.
And this leads us to a specific infrastructure deal that absolutely blew my mind when I read the numbers.
Yeah, the scale of what they are buying is hard to comprehend. The physical reality of artificial intelligence isn't abstract math in the cloud. It is concrete, copper wiring, industrial cooling systems, and highly specialized silicon.
Heavy industry.
Exactly. And the scale of what Anthropic is buying to support a $44 billion run rate is staggering.
And we didn't even find out about this from an Anthropic press release.
No, it was a totally backdoor revelation.
Right. The details leaked through an entirely different industry. In SpaceX's recent S-1 filing, which is the mandatory paperwork they filed for their own upcoming IPO, it was revealed that Anthropic is leasing compute power directly from SpaceX's data centers.
And not just a little overflow capacity.
No. Anthropic is contracted to pay SpaceX $1.25 billion per month through May of 2029 for access to the Colossus IN-2 facilities.
The scale of that single lease is just arresting. Let's run the math against their own projections.
Okay, let's do it.
If Anthropic's Q2 revenue is $10.9 billion, and they are paying SpaceX $3.75 billion for 3 months of compute.
Wow.
That single contract consumes 34.4% of Anthropic's entire projected top-line revenue.
Over a third of every dollar coming in the door goes straight to Elon Musk's operation.
Straight to Colossus.
And let's look at the unit economics of that lease, because they are renting 220,000 GPUs.
A massive cluster.
If you divide the monthly cost by the hardware, Anthropic is paying roughly $5,680 per GPU per month.
Which is astronomical.
Right, because I know the standard public cloud spot rate for equivalent hardware on traditional services like AWS or Google Cloud ranges between $1,500 and $3,000.
Exactly.
Anthropic is paying nearly double the open market rate. Why? It's like renting an apartment for double the market rate just to guarantee the landlord won't kick you out when the neighborhood suddenly gentrifies.
That's a great way to put it, because in 2026, the primary bottleneck in artificial intelligence is no longer algorithmic capability or software engineering.
It's not the math anymore.
No, it is physical capacity. Specifically, It is energy. The Colossus data centers provide something incredibly rare right now. Immediate, guaranteed access to 300 megawatts of electricity.
Because you can't just plug 220,000 GPUs into the standard city grid. You'd black out the whole town.
You absolutely cannot. Building a 300 megawatt data center requires years of substation construction, transmission line approvals, and massive environmental reviews.
Red tape everywhere?
Everywhere. You cannot scale an AI company to a $44 billion run rate if your server's throttled during peak hours because the local utility grid is strained.
So they are paying a premium to guarantee the power stays on.
They are paying double the spot rate for certainty. They are buying the guarantee that their infrastructure will not collapse under the weight of their own hyperscaling.
That makes total sense.
They are paying a massive premium for a resource that is entirely inelastic in the short term. Raw, uninterrupted power.
And they aren't just relying on SpaceX either. They have spread their massive infrastructure footprint across multiple architectures.
They are heavily diversified, yes.
What else are they buying?
Well, they have a $100 billion 10-year commitment to Amazon Web Services, AWS, which focuses heavily on utilizing Amazon's custom-built Trainium chips for a massive initiative called Project Rainier.
$100 billion.
Yeah. And alongside that, they signed a multi-gigawatt deal with Google and Broadcom to use next-generation TPUs, or tensor processing units, starting in 2027.
So they are playing the field.
Very aggressively.
Yeah.
They are spreading their workloads across different silicon architectures to avoid total vendor lock-in with NVIDIA and to secure power wherever it exists globally.
But even with this aggressive spending spree across SpaceX, Amazon, and Google, there is a fascinating divergence in strategy between Anthropic and OpenAI when you look at the long-term projections.
The training cost divergence is perhaps the most important strategic indicator in the industry right now.
Break that down for us.
Anthropic currently projects that their model training costs will peak at around $30 billion by the year 2028.
$30 billion. Sounds like a lot.
It is. But OpenAI, conversely, is projecting an astonishing $121 billion in compute spend for that exact same year.
Wait. Anthropic is projecting to spend 4 times less on future compute than their primary rival, while currently generating more revenue. How's that functionally possible?
It comes down to fundamentally different philosophies on scaling laws. OpenAI is banking on brute force compute.
Just throw more hardware at the problem?
Right. The idea that simply adding more hardware and more raw data will inevitably yield exponential intelligence. Anthropic is banking on capital-efficient training.
Doing more with less.
Exactly. They are heavily utilizing synthetic data, having smaller, highly accurate models generate training data for larger models.
AI. Training AI.
Basically. And they're relying on their constitutional AI framework to steer the model's behavior early in the training process, rather than spending billions on human feedback reinforcement later.
So Anthropic is trying to prove you can win the intelligence race through algorithmic elegance, rather than just brute forcing the global power grid.
That is exactly their bet.
Okay, so if Anthropic is taking a massive chunk of its revenue and handing it over to fund SpaceX's data centers, while also committing $100 billion to AWS and gigawatts of power to Google, where are they getting the initial capital to make those commitments?
That brings us to the accounting magic.
Because this brings us to what might be the most bizarre circular part of this entire deep dive, the hyperscaler valuation feedback loop.
This is where corporate venture capital meets high-tech symbiosis, and it honestly borders on the surreal.
Let's trace the capital flow for the listener because it gets dizzying. Google recently committed up to $40 billion to Anthropic, wiring $10 billion immediately at a $350 billion valuation.
All right.
And Amazon stepped in and committed an additional $5 billion, bringing its total commitment to $13 billion, with options to scale that up to $25 billion.
Right. Massive checks from the big tech incumbents.
So the massive cloud providers, the hyperscalers, are pouring tens of billions into the AI startup. On the surface, that looks like traditional investing.
But the accounting mechanics happening on the back end are wild.
So wild. Let's look at Alphabet, Google's parent company, and their recent Q1 earnings report. They reported a record $62.6 billion quarterly profit.
A historic quarter for them.
But nearly half of that profit, $28.7 billion, did not come from selling search ads or cloud storage. It came purely from the upward revaluation of their pre-existing 14% stake in Anthropic.
This is the mechanism of mark-to-market accounting. It generates what is known as a paper profit.
Walk us through how that actually works, step by step.
Let's break it down. Imagine Google previously invested in Anthropic when the company was valued at $100 billion.
Okay, they got in early.
Right. When Google and Amazon pumped new money into Anthropic at a $350 billion valuation, the value of Google's older initial shares just explodes.
Because the whole pie is suddenly worth more.
Exactly. Legally, Google must mark the value of that asset up on their balance sheet. So without actually selling a single product or liquidating a single share, Google reports a massive financial gain to Wall Street.
It's literally just numbers on a spreadsheet.
Yep. Amazon did the exact same thing in their earnings. They claimed a $16.8 billion non-operating pre-tax gain from its Anthropic holdings.
Let me make sure I have this straight. Because it sounds like a financial perpetual motion machine.
It really does.
The cloud provider invests billions of cash into the AI startup. That influx of cash causes the AI startup's valuation to spike.
Right.
The cloud provider then looks at their balance sheet, claims a massive paper profit from that spike, and uses that profit to show Wall Street how brilliantly their investments are doing.
Exactly.
But then, and this is the crazy part, the AI startup takes that initial invested cash and uses it to buy cloud computing services back from the exact same cloud provider.
Back to the source.
They are just handing the money back and forth, inflating the valuation and the cloud revenue simultaneously. Is this a sustainable economic ecosystem, or is this just a closed-loop economy inflating its own balloon until it pops?
It is both a brilliant mechanism for rapid scaling and a highly precarious systemic risk. It is capital recycling at its most aggressive.
Capital recycling.
And to answer your question, it is sustainable only as long as the AI startup, in this case Anthropic, continues to generate massive, real, external cash from enterprise customers.
So the outside world has to keep injecting real money into the loop.
Yes. The loop we just described only holds up if products like Claude Code keep extracting billions of dollars from the broader economy outside of the tech bubble.
Because if the Fortune 500 companies wake up one morning and decide the AI agents aren't actually yielding the productivity gains they hope for, and they cancel those million-dollar B2B contracts, what happens to the loop?
The entire architecture fractures rapidly.
Fast.
Overnight. If the external enterprise revenue stops, Anthropic cannot mathematically justify a $350 billion or $900 billion valuation.
Right. The math falls apart.
And if that valuation drops, the hyperscalers, Google and Amazon, must immediately write down those massive paper profits,
turning them into massive losses.
turning them into punishing multi-billion-dollar losses on their balance sheets, which would crater their stock prices. Furthermore, Anthropic would run out of the actual cash needed to buy the cloud compute.
So the hyperscalers lose their highest paying customers too.
Yes, and they are left with empty, multi-billion-dollar data centers. It is a highly leveraged ecosystem of mutual dependence. Every player is holding the others up.
So that entire financial house of cards, the entire loop, relies absolutely on Anthropic maintaining a pristine, trusted reputation with their enterprise clients.
Absolutely pristine.
They have to be seen as the safest, most reliable infrastructure in the world, which is exactly why what happened next in the geopolitical arena almost broke the whole system. Let's talk about the clash with the military.
The intersection of frontier artificial intelligence and national security was always inevitable.
The stakes are just too high.
Right. The computational power of these models naturally lends itself to defense logistics, intelligence gathering, and cyber warfare. The clash came to a head rapidly when the U.S. Department of Defense officially requested unrestricted access to Anthropic's Claude models.
They wanted it for military use.
The Pentagon wanted to integrate the AI deeply into military and intelligence applications.
And Anthropic, sitting on this massive enterprise empire, flatly said no.
They refused the DoD's request.
Yeah.
Anthropic cited their foundational safety commitments, their strict internal anti-surveillance policies, and a hardline corporate stance against contributing in any way to lethal autonomous weapons systems.
Now, we are remaining totally impartial here. We are just looking at the market dynamics, but the fallout from that decision was explosive, both politically and economically.
Extremely explosive.
The Pentagon officially labeled Anthropic a national security supply chain risk, which is a devastating label for a company trying to sell B2B infrastructure.
It's the last thing you want Fortune 500 companies to hear.
Exactly. President Trump then issued an executive directive outright banning federal agencies from utilizing Claude in any capacity.
A total federal lockout.
And predictably, the moment Anthropic stepped back, OpenAI immediately stepped into the void, revised their own internal safety terms, and took the lucrative Pentagon contract.
From a purely objective market dynamics perspective, the positioning was stark. On one side, you have a major AI lab branded with a federal ban and penalized by the Defense Department.
And on the other side,
A primary competitor willingly taking on the defense contracts and integrating with the military apparatus.
but the plot twist here is incredible. The government ban actually triggered a massive organic consumer backlash against OpenAI.
It really did. A movement called Quit GPT went viral online.
Right. Millions of consumers uncomfortable with the military integration of their daily AI assistant began mass canceling subscriptions.
And as a direct result, Claude skyrocketed to the #1 spot on the Apple App Store free charts.
It's a fascinating study in unintended market consequences.
It truly is. A strict internal safety policy, which effectively locked Anthropic out of the multi-billion-dollar defense sector, accidentally functioned as the ultimate consumer marketing campaign.
The best TR they never paid for.
Exactly. Anthropic, a company that we established, was traditionally hyper-focused on boring B2B enterprise contracts, suddenly saw an unprecedented flood of viral consumer adoption. And it was driven entirely by their geopolitical stance.
But there is a layer of deep irony to this, too. Because despite the executive directive and despite the Pentagon's supply chain risk label, the federal government isn't actually fully unplugged from Anthropic's ecosystem.
No, the reality of critical infrastructure is highly complex. Reports indicate that top-tier intelligence agencies, specifically the NSA, are reportedly still utilizing an unreleased, highly advanced Anthropic model.
The Claude Mythos preview model.
Yes, they're using it specifically for advanced cybersecurity threat detection and defensive infrastructure testing.
This is wild to me. How does a company balance being publicly banned by a presidential directive and labeled a security risk by the Pentagon, while simultaneously their technology is so deeply effective that the NSA is quietly using a preview version of it to secure the nation's networks?
But a massive contradiction.
And on top of that, they are scheduled to brief global financial regulators on cybersecurity vulnerabilities.
It highlights how indispensable these frontier models have become to maintaining parity in global security. The executive branch may issue directives based on policy, but operators on the ground in cybersecurity and intelligence will ultimately gravitate toward the most mathematically capable tools available to defend their networks.
Regardless of the politics.
Exactly, regardless of the politics. It places Anthropic in a remarkably unique position. They are publicly penalized by the defense establishment, championed by privacy-focused consumers, relied upon by Fortune 500 enterprises, and quietly utilized by the intelligence community.
Which means all of these incredibly tangled threads are about to be pulled tight. The massive $44 billion revenue run rates, the $1.25 billion monthly compute bills to SpaceX, the creative non-GAAP accounting, the hyperscaler feedback loops, and this wild geopolitical public hype. They are all converging on one final brutal test.
The transition to the public markets.
The late 2026 IPO race is shaping up to be a historic moment for global capital. Let's look at the timeline.
Let's add your calendar.
We have SpaceX expected to list in June at a valuation somewhere between $1.75 and $2.3 trillion. OpenAI is expected to go public in September, targeting an $850 billion to $1.1 trillion valuation.
Massive numbers.
And Anthropic is expected right behind them in October, floating around that $900 billion valuation mark.
Bringing private companies of this unprecedented scale to retail investors fundamentally changes the nature of the scrutiny they face.
Because it's not just closed-door meetings anymore.
Right. In private fundraising rounds, these AI labs are dealing with venture capitalists, sovereign wealth funds, and the hyperscalers themselves. That specific class of investor understands and tolerates massive capital expenditure cycles.
They have a huge appetite for risk.
They are playing a decade-long game and are perfectly comfortable with multi-billion-dollar cash burns.
Right. A venture capitalist looks at that $121 billion compute projection from OpenAI and says, great, you're building the future, here is another check. But a pension fund manager in Ohio looks at that and asks, when do I get a dividend?
Exactly. Contrast the financial health of these companies as they prepare their public roadshows.
Let's do that.
OpenAI is projected to burn $27 billion in cash in 2026 alone. They are actively telling investors they do not expect to reach cash flow break-even until 2029 or 2030.
So they are selling a vision of future dominance.
Anthropic, however, is leaning entirely into the narrative we started this discussion with. Q2 operational profitability, capital-efficient training, and immediate enterprise revenue generation.
So what does this all mean when the bell rings on the stock exchange? When regular retail investors, 401k managers, and institutional mutual funds finally get to buy into these AI IPOs, what are they actually buying?
That is the big unknown.
Are they buying shares in high-margin software companies like a Microsoft or a Salesforce? Or, considering the gigawatts of power and the massive data centers, are they basically funding a new national utility grid?
That is the defining financial question of this era. Wall Street is going to have to decide how to price this new sector. If investors view AI as traditional software, they will demand rapid returns, expanding gross margins, and immediate GAAP profitability.
Which means those non-GAAP tricks won't fly.
Right. If that happens, the massive compute burn rates will be heavily penalized. But if the market decides that AI is a utility, if compute is fundamentally the new electricity, then investors might accept massive, unending infrastructure costs, enormous debt loads, and a much longer horizon for profitability.
Just as they did when the telecom companies laid millions of miles of fiber optic cable in the late 90s.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Anthropic is attempting a highly delicate tightrope walk, projecting the clean operational leverage of a software company while quietly financing and building the heavy physical infrastructure of a global utility.
It is a phenomenal balancing act. So just to recap the journey we've been on today, we've explored how a single company flipped the script on AI profitability, proving that massive revenue can be generated today by capturing the enterprise developer market.
A huge paradigm shift.
We dug into the hidden realities behind their non-GAAP accounting and the astronomical costs of talent. We looked at their massive physical infrastructure bills, paying double the market rate to secure power from SpaceX.
Power being the ultimate bottleneck.
We untangled the wild financial feedback loops inflating the valuations of the hyperscalers. And we looked at how a tense geopolitical standoff accidentally turned a B2B company into a viral consumer phenomenon, all right before a historic trillion-dollar IPO showdown.
And as we watch these companies finalize their transition from the speculative laboratories into the public markets, there is one final reality to mull over.
Let's hear it.
If the true bottleneck to the future of artificial intelligence isn't the intelligence of the algorithms, but rather the sheer physical limits of gigawatts, copper wire, and data center concrete. Wait, let me rephrase that. If the limits are purely physical, who really controls the future? The companies writing the algorithms or the companies that own the power grid?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. As you watch these incredible financial headlines roll out over the next few months, keep questioning the numbers behind the narratives. Remember that the next time you look at artificial intelligence, you aren't just looking at software floating in the cloud. You are smelling the ozone, hearing the hum of the turbines, and watching the heavy industry of the 21st century being built from the ground up. See you next time.